He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone, but had no idea he was about to dismantle his own career in a single courtroom session. The courtroom of District Courtroom 3B carried a quiet authority that morning, the kind that pressed down on every shoulder like invisible weight, polished oak benches lined in perfect rows, sunlight cutting through tall windows and reflecting off the marble floors, and at the center of it all sat Judge Richard Holloway, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper ego, his black robe draped like armor as he flipped through a thin file with visible disinterest, already convinced of the outcome before a single word had been spoken, because to him, this case was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, and the woman standing before him was even less than that. Emily Carter stood alone at the defendant's table, her hands resting lightly on the edge, her posture composed but unassuming, dressed in a simple navy sweater and modest slacks, the kind of outfit that made her blend into any ordinary crowd. And that was precisely the problem, because in a room built on perception, she looked like someone who didn't belong. Whispers traveled quietly across the benches, low enough to be polite but loud enough to wound, a few observers exchanging knowing glances, already forming judgments without facts, already deciding who she was, or more importantly, who she wasn't. Judge Holloway didn't even try to hide the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he finally looked up, his gaze scanning her briefly, dismissively, as if measuring her worth in a matter of seconds and finding it lacking. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice echoing with practiced authority, slow and deliberate, designed not just to speak but to dominate, "I trust you understand the seriousness of why you've been summoned here today." The tone alone made it clear this wasn't a question, it was a setup. Emily nodded slightly, her voice calm but soft. "Yes, Your Honor," but before she could continue, he raised a hand, cutting her off mid-thought, the interruption sharp, intentional, a subtle signal to everyone watching that her voice held no weight here. "Let's be clear," he continued, leaning forward just enough to command the room's attention, "this court does not operate on confusion or excuses, so I suggest you choose your words carefully." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled but impossible to ignore, the kind of laughter that didn't come from humor but from alignment, from people instinctively siding with authority. Emily's fingers tightened slightly against the table, not in panic, but in restraint, because moments like this weren't new to her, the judgment, the dismissal, the assumption that simplicity meant weakness. Judge Holloway flipped another page in the file, though it was clear he had barely read it, his mind already made up. "You've been brought before this court regarding a failure to comply with a legal notice," he said, his voice louder now, projecting confidence that bordered on theatrical, "and from what I can see, you've made little effort to resolve the matter before it escalated to this point." The accusation hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, crafted to make her appear negligent, irresponsible, small. Emily opened her mouth again, ready to respond. But once more, he didn't let her. "Actually," he added quickly, his tone sharpening, "before you say anything, I should remind you that this is not a classroom, Miss Carter, this is a court of law." The words landed like a calculated strike, subtle but precise, drawing another wave of suppressed amusement from the audience, and in that moment, the imbalance was undeniable, one man elevated by position, using it not just to preside but to perform, and one woman standing alone, expected to falter. Under the weight of it, the air in the room shifted slightly, tension building like a storm just beyond the horizon, because what no one in that courtroom knew, not the spectators, not the clerks, and certainly not Judge Holloway, was that the quiet woman standing before them wasn't confused, wasn't unprepared, and wasn't out of her depth. She was waiting, and the longer he spoke, the more certain it became that he was giving her exactly what she needed: evidence, mistakes, openings. But for now, she remained still, her expression steady, her silence mistaken for uncertainty, and as Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, convinced he was in complete control, the room settled into a fragile, expectant quiet, the kind that comes just before everything changes, because respect is often demanded loudly, but truth has a way of arriving in silence, and when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. Judge Holloway allowed the faintest pause to linger, just long enough for the room to settle into his version of order. Then he tapped his pen lightly against the bench, the sound sharp and deliberate, drawing every eye back to him as if nothing else in the room mattered. "Now," he said, his tone measured but edged with impatience, "let us proceed efficiently, Miss Carter, because this court has more pressing matters than unnecessary delays." The implication was clear. She was the delay, the inconvenience, the disruption to his carefully controlled environment. Emily remained still, her gaze steady but respectful, not challenging, not submissive, simply present, a balance that unsettled more than it impressed. The clerk to the side shifted slightly, organizing papers that had already been arranged, the quiet rustle the only movement breaking the stillness. According to the record, Holloway continued, glancing down with exaggerated focus. You failed to respond appropriately to a formal notice issued 3 weeks ago. A notice which clearly outlined the required steps to resolve this matter without court intervention. He looked up again, this time holding her gaze longer, as if daring her to contradict him. Would you care to explain why this court should not interpret your actions as disregard for legal procedure? A murmur passed through the gallery, subtle but present, people leaning forward just enough to catch every word. Drawn in by the slow tightening of pressure, Emily inhaled quietly, her voice calm when she spoke. Your Honor, I did respond to that notice within the specified time frame. Her words were clear, measured, but before they could fully settle, Holloway raised his hand again, sharper this time, cutting her off with visible impatience. Then perhaps, he interjected, his tone carrying a hint of mock curiosity, you would like to explain why there is no such response reflected in this file. He lifted the thin folder slightly, as if it were undeniable proof, the gesture small but theatrical, designed to reinforce his authority. A few heads nodded in the audience, the visual alone convincing enough for those who had already chosen a side. Emily's expression did not change, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the file, then back to him. Your Honor, if I may finish, she said, her voice still controlled, still respectful, but now carrying a subtle firmness that had not been there before. A shift so slight most would miss it, but not Holloway. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, irritation flickering beneath the surface. You may, he replied, though the permission sounded more like a challenge than an allowance. Emily continued, I submitted my response electronically within 48 hours of receiving the notice, including all requested documentation and confirmation of receipt. Her words were precise, each detail placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive, simply stated, the kind of clarity that did not seek approval, only acknowledgement. A brief silence followed, the kind that made the room lean in without realizing it. Holloway's fingers tapped once more against the bench, slower this time, his confidence still intact but now accompanied by something else, a need to reassert control. Electronic submissions, he said, almost dismissively, are subject to verification and proper filing procedures, Ms. Carter. Something I would expect even a layperson to understand. The word layperson lingered. Deliberate, chosen, another subtle attempt to place her below the standard he represented. A faint ripple of agreement moved through the gallery again, but it was weaker this time, less certain, as if the room itself was beginning to question the rhythm of the exchange. Emily did not react to the remark, did not defend herself against the implication. Instead she held her ground, her posture unchanged, her voice steady when she spoke again. Yes, Your Honor, and that is precisely why I insured. The submission included a timestamp, confirmation number, an acknowledgement from the court's own electronic filing system. The words landed differently this time, not as a rebuttal, but as a statement of fact that carried weight beyond tone. Holloway's expression flickered, just for a moment, a crack too small for most to notice, but enough to shift the air in the room. The clerk glanced down at the file again, then at the computer screen beside her, hesitation creeping into her movements. Subtle but visible, the balance was changing, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and yet it was there. If such documentation exists, Holloway said, his voice tightening just slightly, then it would be reflected in the official record before this court. But the certainty in his tone had softened, replaced by something closer to insistence than confidence. Emily tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the statement. Her next words calm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. With respect, Your Honor, the absence of that documentation in this file does not mean it was never submitted. The room went still, not with shock, but with recognition, the first real shift in momentum, because for the first time since the proceedings began, someone had not only responded to the judge, but had done so without hesitation, without fear, and without stepping outside the boundaries of respect. Holloway leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully now, no longer dismissing, no longer certain. The performance had begun to slip, and in its place, Something far more dangerous was emerging: awareness, the realization that the narrative he had constructed might not hold, and somewhere in that growing silence, the first thread of doubt began to take shape, thin, fragile, but unmistakably real. Judge Holloway allowed the faintest pause to linger, just long enough for the room to settle into his version of order, then he tapped his pen lightly against the bench, the sound sharp and deliberate, drawing every eye back to him as if nothing else in the room mattered. "Now," he said, his tone measured but edged with impatience, "let us proceed efficiently, Miss Carter, because this court has more pressing matters than unnecessary delays." The implication was clear: she was the delay, the inconvenience, the disruption to his carefully controlled environment. Emily remained still, her gaze steady but respectful, not challenging, not submissive, simply present, a balance that unsettled more than it impressed. The clerk to the side shifted slightly, organizing papers that had already been arranged, the quiet rustle the only movement breaking the stillness. "According to the record," Holloway continued, glancing down with exaggerated focus, "you failed to respond appropriately to a formal notice issued 3 weeks ago, a notice which clearly outlined the required steps to resolve this matter without court intervention." He looked up again, this time holding her gaze longer, as if daring her to contradict him. "Would you care to explain why this court should not interpret your actions as disregard for legal procedure?" A murmur passed through the gallery, subtle but present, people leaning forward just enough to catch every word, drawn in by the slow tightening of pressure. Emily inhaled quietly, her voice calm when she spoke. "Your Honor, I did respond to that notice within the specified time frame." Her words were clear, measured, but before they could fully settle, Holloway raised his hand again, sharper this time, cutting her off with visible impatience. "Then perhaps," he interjected, his tone carrying a hint of mock curiosity, "you would like to explain why there is no such response reflected in this file." He lifted the thin folder slightly, as if it were undeniable proof, the gesture small but theatrical, designed to reinforce his authority. A few heads nodded in the audience, the visual alone convincing enough for those who had already chosen a side. Emily's expression did not change, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the file, then back to him. "Your Honor, if I may finish," she said, her voice still controlled, still respectful, but now carrying a subtle firmness that had not been there before, a shift so slight most would miss it, but not Holloway. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, irritation flickering beneath the surface. "You may," he replied, though the permission sounded more like a challenge than an allowance. Emily continued, "I submitted my response electronically within 48 hours of receiving the notice, including all requested documentation and confirmation of receipt." Her words were precise, each detail placed carefully, not rushed, not defensive, simply stated, the kind of clarity that did not seek approval, only acknowledgement. A brief silence followed, the kind that made the room lean in without realizing it. Holloway's fingers tapped once more against the bench, slower this time, his confidence still intact but now accompanied by something else: a need to reassert control. "Electronic submissions," he said, almost dismissively, "are subject to verification and proper filing procedures, Ms. Carter, something I would expect even a layperson to understand." The word layperson lingered, deliberate, chosen, another subtle attempt to place her below the standard he represented. A faint ripple of agreement moved through the gallery again, but it was weaker this time, less certain, as if the room itself was beginning to question the rhythm of the exchange. Emily did not react to the remark, did not defend herself against the implication. Instead she held her ground, her posture unchanged, her voice steady when she spoke again. "Yes, Your Honor, and that is precisely why I ensured the submission included a timestamp, confirmation number, and acknowledgement from the court's own electronic filing system." The words landed differently this time, not as a rebuttal, but as a statement of fact that carried weight beyond tone. Holloway's expression flickered, just for a moment, a crack too small for most to notice, but enough to shift the air in the room. The clerk glanced down at the file again, then at the computer screen beside her, hesitation creeping into her movements, subtle but visible. The balance was changing, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and yet it was there. "If such documentation exists," Holloway said, his voice tightening just slightly, "then it would be reflected in the official record before this court." But the certainty in his tone had softened, replaced by something closer to insistence than confidence. Emily tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the statement, her next words calm, deliberate and impossible to ignore. With respect, Your Honor, the absence of that documentation in this file does not mean it was never submitted. The room went still, not with shock, but with recognition, the first real shift in momentum. Because for the first time since the proceedings began, someone had not only responded to the judge, but had done so without hesitation, without fear, and without stepping outside the boundaries of respect. Holloway leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully now, no longer dismissing, no longer certain. The performance had begun to slip, and in its place, something far more dangerous was emerging: awareness, the realization that the narrative he had constructed might not hold. And somewhere in that growing silence, the first thread of doubt began to take shape, thin, fragile, but unmistakably real. The shift in the courtroom did not announce itself loudly, it settled in like a slow change in pressure, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Judge Holloway remained still for a moment longer than usual, his eyes fixed on Emily Carter as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about her. The earlier confidence that once filled his posture now carried a trace of calculation. The kind that comes when control is no longer absolute. Procedural concern, he repeated, his voice quieter now, but edged with something sharper, not mockery this time, but scrutiny. That is a serious implication, Miss Carter. The words were measured, deliberate, designed to test her footing, to see if she would retreat under the weight of them. But Emily did not move. Her expression remained composed, her hands resting lightly against the table, fingers no longer tense but steady, grounded. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her tone respectful but unwavering, and I believe it is necessary to address it before proceeding further. The room reacted not with sound, but with attention, a collective leaning forward, drawn into the precision of her response, the earlier whispers now replaced by silence that carried curiosity instead of judgment. Holloway tilted his head slightly, studying her with a new kind of focus, no longer dismissive, but cautious. And on what basis, he asked, do you make that determination? The question was direct, but it lacked the earlier condescension, replaced now by something closer to challenge. Emily inhaled quietly, her gaze steady as she answered, on the basis that the court's own system has confirmed receipt of my response within the required timeframe. Yet that response was not included in the materials used to evaluate my compliance. She paused briefly, allowing the logic to settle, which suggests a discrepancy between the system of record and the file presented today. The clarity of her words cut through the room with quiet precision, not aggressive, not defensive, simply undeniable. The clerk shifted again, this time more noticeably, her eyes returning to the screen as if verifying what had already been confirmed. A man seated near the back lowered his arms, leaning forward now with full attention, while another exchanged a glance with the person beside him, the earlier certainty replaced by quiet reconsideration. Holloway's fingers moved again, not tapping this time, but resting against the edge of the bench, his posture leaning slightly forward. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that this court has proceeded on incomplete information. The phrasing was careful, controlled, but it carried weight, because to acknowledge the possibility was to open the door to something far larger than a minor case. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. I am stating that the information currently before the court does not reflect the full record of my compliance, she said, her voice even, her words precise, and that proceeding without addressing that discrepancy could lead to an inaccurate conclusion. The room went still again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more focused, because what had begun as a routine hearing was now revealing cracks in its own foundation. Holloway leaned back slowly, his expression composed but no longer unshakable, the faintest tension visible in the set of his jaw. And what would you propose, Ms. Carter? He asked, his tone measured, no longer dismissive, but no longer fully confident either. The question hung in the air, not as a trap, but as an opening. Emily paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but intention, as if choosing her next words with care. I would propose, she began, that the court formally acknowledge the existence of the electronic submission, verify its contents, and ensure that all relevant documentation is included in the official record before any determination is made. Her delivery was calm, structured, each step laid out with clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. The clerk's hands hovered over the keyboard, waiting, the room holding its breath in a way that felt deliberate now, not accidental. Holloway's gaze remained fixed on her, searching, measuring, and for the first time, there was no immediate interruption. no quick dismissal, only consideration, the kind that signals a shift in power too subtle to name, but too real to ignore, and in that quiet, unfolding moment, the dynamic of the courtroom had changed, not through force, not through volume, but through precision, because the person who had once been expected to defend herself was now guiding the direction of the proceedings, and the one who had sought to control it was beginning to realize that control was no longer entirely his. The room did not erupt, it did not react with noise or spectacle, it simply settled into a deeper silence. The kind that comes when something undeniable has taken root, and in that silence, one truth became clear to everyone watching: this was no longer about a simple case, it was about who truly understood the law, and who had only assumed they did. The silence did not fade this time, it deepened, settling over the courtroom like a weight that no one dared to disturb. Judge Holloway remained still, his gaze fixed on Emily Carter as if measuring not just her words, but the precision behind them, the kind of precision that could not be improvised, the kind that came from understanding rather than assumption. His fingers slowly unclasped from each other, resting flat against the bench as he exhaled quietly, a controlled breath that carried more calculation than confidence. "Very well," he said at last, his voice steady but no longer edged with superiority. "The court will review the electronic submission." The words were simple, procedural, yet their impact was unmistakable, a subtle shift in authority that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. The clerk nodded immediately, her hands moving with renewed purpose, pulling up the full submission on the screen, her posture more attentive now, more careful, as though aware that every detail mattered. The faint clicking of keys echoed again, but this time it did not feel routine, it felt consequential. Emily remained composed, her eyes steady, her breathing even, as if this moment had always been part of a larger sequence she had already accounted for. A man near the aisle leaned forward further, elbows resting on his knees, his earlier skepticism replaced entirely by focus, while another spectator who had once smirked now sat motionless, his expression tightened with quiet anticipation. "The document is loading," the clerk said softly, her voice breaking the silence just enough to remind everyone that the process was still moving, still unfolding. Judge Holloway nodded once, his attention never leaving the screen now, the shift in his posture subtle but undeniable. He was no longer directing the moment, he was observing it, and that distinction carried weight. Seconds passed, stretching longer than they should have, until finally the clerk spoke again, this time with certainty. "Your Honor, the submission includes a complete response to the notice, along with supporting documentation and confirmation of compliance." The words landed with quiet finality, no hesitation, no uncertainty, just fact. The room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, but something changed, something settled into place, the kind of realization that moves through people without needing sound. Holloway's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes scanning the screen as if searching for something, an inconsistency, a flaw, anything that might restore the balance he had lost, but there was none. The evidence was clear, structured, undeniable, and more than that, it was thorough, far beyond what would be expected from someone he had already dismissed. "Scroll," he said, his voice controlled, though quieter now. The clerk obeyed, revealing page after page of organized documentation, timestamps, references, legal citations, each detail reinforcing the same conclusion. Emily Carter had not only complied, she had done so with a level of precision that suggested something far deeper than casual understanding. The man in the second row leaned back slowly, shaking his head almost imperceptibly, as if re-evaluating everything he had assumed just minutes ago. A woman near the back exchanged a glance with her companion, her earlier expression of indifference replaced by something closer to respect. The room was no longer watching a simple hearing, it was witnessing a shift. "Ms. Carter," Holloway said after a moment, his voice measured, careful, "did you prepare this submission yourself?" The question carried weight, not because of its content, but because of what it implied. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her tone steady, unembellished, the simplicity of her answer only amplifying its impact. Another pause followed, longer this time, heavier, the kind that signals a realization forming in real time. Holloway leaned back again, but this time the movement felt different, less controlled, more reflective, his earlier certainty replaced by something he could not fully conceal, recognition. The understanding that the person he had underestimated was not merely capable, but precise, deliberate, and prepared in ways he had not anticipated these citations, he continued, his eyes returning briefly to the screen. They reference procedural standards that are not commonly cited in cases of this nature. His tone was no longer dismissive, it was analytical, cautious. How did you determine their relevance? The room leaned in again, drawn not by tension now, but by curiosity, because the question itself marked a turning point. Emily paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but intention, her answer. Calm, direct, and impossible to ignore, because those standards govern the exact conditions under which a submission is considered valid within the court's own system, she said, her voice even, and if those conditions are met, then the absence of the document in a physical file does not negate its legal standing. The words settled into the room with quiet authority, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. And in that moment, the final piece fell into place, the understanding that this was no longer a matter of defense, but of demonstration, not of reaction, but of control. Judge Holloway did not interrupt, did not challenge, he simply listened, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was absolute, because for the first time since the hearing began, the balance had fully shifted, and everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The silence did not feel fragile anymore, it felt decisive, like something irreversible had already taken place even though no final ruling had been spoken. Judge Holloway remained seated, but the authority that once radiated from him had shifted into something quieter, more measured, his eyes no longer scanning for errors but studying Emily Carter with a depth that suggested recalculation, not of the case, but of her. The clerk continued to scroll slowly through the submission, each page reinforcing what had already become undeniable, timestamps aligned, confirmations verified, citations precise and strategically placed, the kind of structure that did not come from guesswork, but from mastery. A faint movement in the gallery broke the stillness as someone adjusted in their seat, not out of boredom, but discomfort, because the narrative they had accepted at the beginning was no longer holding together. Miss Carter, Holloway said after a long pause, his voice steady but carrying a different weight now, no longer dismissive, no longer performative. You referenced procedural standards that directly address discrepancies between electronic and physical records. He leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the bench, grounded, controlled. Are you formally asserting that the court's handling of this documentation has affected the integrity of these proceedings? The question landed carefully, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement of what was already unfolding. The room leaned in again, drawn by the precision of the exchange. Emily did not hesitate, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. I am asserting that any determination made without full consideration of verified submissions risks being incomplete, she replied, her voice calm, deliberate, and that ensuring accuracy in the record is essential to maintaining the integrity of the process. Her words were not confrontational, they were exact, structured in a way that left no room for dismissal without consequence. The clerk glanced briefly at Holloway, then back to the screen, as if aware that the responsibility of confirmation now carried greater significance than before. A man in the front row exhaled slowly, his earlier skepticism replaced entirely by quiet respect, while another observer lowered his head slightly, as though reconsidering every assumption he had made upon first seeing her walk into the room. Holloway's expression remained composed, but the tension in his jaw had softened, replaced by something more complex. A recognition that control in this moment did not come from interruption, but from response. The court acknowledges the presence of the electronic submission, he said finally, his voice clear, measured, each word carrying the weight of formal recognition, and will incorporate it into the official record. The statement shifted the room once more, not dramatically, but definitively, because it marked a turning point that could not be undone. Emily inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, not of victory, but of process, as though this was simply the next expected step in a sequence she had already mapped out. Holloway continued, his tone now fully grounded in procedure rather than performance. Given this information, the court must reassess the basis upon which this hearing was initiated. He paused briefly, allowing the implication to settle, including whether the initial claim of non-compliance was valid. The words echoed softly across the courtroom, and with them came a realization that spread silently through every person present. The case that had begun as a demonstration of authority was now being reconsidered entirely. Not because of argument, but because of evidence, not because of force, but because of precision. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, her calm no longer mistaken for uncertainty, but recognized for what it was, control, the kind that does not demand attention, but commands it nonetheless. The clerk adjusted the file, now incorporating the verified documents into the official record, her movements careful, deliberate, as if aware that every action now carried weight beyond routine. Holloway leaned back slightly, his eyes lifting once more to meet Emily's, and in that moment, there was no trace of the earlier smirk, no hint of condescension, only a measured acknowledgement of what stood before him. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, but unmistakably respectful, "your understanding of these procedures is thorough." The pause before the final word carried more meaning than the word itself, because it signaled a shift that no one in the room could ignore. The transformation of perception from dismissal to recognition, from assumption to respect. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of realization, the kind that settles in when something undeniable has taken place, and in that stillness, one truth became clear to everyone watching: authority may shape a room, but knowledge has the power to redefine it, and in this moment, that power no longer belonged to the bench alone. The acknowledgement did not fade quickly, it lingered in the air like something that could not be taken back, Judge Holloway's final words still echoing in the minds of everyone present as the courtroom settled into a deeper, more deliberate silence, one that no longer belonged to him alone. Emily Carter stood exactly as she had before, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her had shifted. The clerk adjusted the updated record carefully, ensuring every document was properly logged, her movements slower now, more precise, as if aware that even the smallest detail carried significance. A man in the gallery straightened in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet attentiveness, while another leaned slightly toward his neighbor, whispering something too soft to hear, but not soft enough to escape notice, because the room itself had become aware of its own transformation. Given the updated record, Holloway continued, his voice steady but noticeably restrained, "The court must now determine whether the initial claim brought against Ms. Carter holds any standing." The words were procedural, expected, but their tone carried a shift that could not be ignored. This was no longer a performance of authority, it was a process of correction. Emily listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived, the kind of anticipation that does not come from luck, but from preparation. Holloway glanced briefly at the file again, then back at her, and for the first time, there was no attempt to control the rhythm of the exchange, only to follow it. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice measured, "based on the documentation now before this court, it appears that your response was both timely and complete." A pause followed, not out of uncertainty, but weight, which would indicate that the premise of non-compliance is no longer supported. The statement settled into the room with quiet finality, and with it came a subtle but unmistakable shift in perception. The case that had once positioned her as negligent now revealed itself as flawed, not through argument, but through evidence. The gallery reacted not with noise, but with stillness, a collective recognition that something had been corrected in real time. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without expression, her calm no longer misread as passivity, but recognized as control. Holloway exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for just a moment before returning to her, as if adjusting to a reality that had changed. Without his permission, in light of this, he continued, the court must consider whether this matter should have proceeded to a formal hearing at all. The implication was clear, not only had the claim failed, but the process itself had been called into question. The clerk paused briefly, her hands resting on the keyboard as if waiting for direction, but none came immediately, because for the first time, the certainty that once guided every moment in this room had been replaced by something else, accountability. Emily remained still, but there was a subtle shift now, not in posture, but in presence, as if she was no longer standing within the system, but slightly above the assumptions that had defined it. "Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying a clarity that cut through the stillness, "if I may." The request was simple, respectful, but it held weight, because it was no longer a plea to be heard, it was an expectation. Holloway looked at her, not with dismissal, but with attention. "You may," he replied, and the permission carried no edge, no challenge, only acknowledgement. Emily continued, "If the court recognizes that the submission was valid and timely, then the question is not only whether the claim should proceed, but whether the process that led to this hearing was consistent with the standards it is meant to uphold. Her words were measured, deliberate, each one placed with precision, not to challenge authority, but to define its boundaries. The room went still again, deeper than before, because the implication extended beyond the case, beyond the moment, into the structure itself. Holloway did not interrupt, did not redirect, he simply listened, and that alone marked a shift more powerful than any statement. The clerk glanced at him briefly, then back at the screen, as if aware that the next decision would carry weight beyond routine. A man in the back row lowered his gaze, shaking his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in realization, the kind that comes when certainty gives way to truth. Holloway leaned back slowly, his hands resting against the bench, his posture composed but no longer dominant, and in that moment, it became clear that the control he once held had not been taken from him. It had been redefined, not by force, but by clarity, not by volume, but by precision. And as the courtroom settled into that undeniable understanding, one truth stood quietly at the center of it all. The person who had been expected to defend herself had instead revealed the flaws in the system itself, and the one who had tried to expose weakness had instead uncovered something far more difficult to ignore. The weight of her words did not dissipate, it settled deeper into the room, anchoring itself in a place that could not be easily dismissed. Judge Holloway remained still, his gaze fixed on Emily Carter, but no longer with the guarded calculation of earlier moments. Now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives when certainty is no longer sustainable. The clerk sat poised, hands resting lightly near the keyboard, waiting, not for instruction alone, but for direction that carried meaning beyond routine procedure. The gallery remained silent, not out of tension now, but out of awareness, because what was unfolding was no longer a simple correction, it was a redefinition of the moment itself. The court acknowledges your statement, Holloway said finally, his voice steady, stripped of its earlier sharpness, each word deliberate, measured, as if chosen with care, and recognizes that the procedural integrity of this matter must be evaluated alongside the claim itself. The phrasing was precise, but the implication was far broader. The case had shifted from a question of compliance to a question of process, and in that shift, the balance of authority had been quietly rewritten. Emily remained composed, her eyes steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle difference now, not in her stance, but in the way the room responded to it. No longer overlooking, no longer underestimating, but listening fully. The clerk adjusted the screen once more, pulling up the internal log associated with the filing system, her movements careful, intentional. Your Honor, she said softly, the system log confirms that the submission was received, processed, and marked as complete within the required timeframe. The words carried a quiet finality, reinforcing what had already become undeniable, but also extending it further. This was not an isolated oversight, it was a confirmed record. Holloway nodded slowly, his fingers resting flat against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer asserting rhythm, simply present, absorbing. Then the court must also consider, he continued, his tone measured, whether the failure to include this documentation in the physical record reflects a breakdown in internal procedure. The statement did not accuse, but it did not excuse either. It existed in that narrow space where responsibility could no longer be ignored. A man in the front row shifted slightly, his posture straightening, as if instinctively recognizing the gravity of the moment, while another observer glanced down briefly, avoiding eye contact with the unfolding realization. Because what had once seemed simple had now become layered, complex, undeniable. Emily's gaze did not waver. Her calm no longer mistaken for restraint, but understood as clarity. She did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence unnecessarily, because she no longer needed to. The process itself was now moving in the direction she had already outlined. Holloway exhaled quietly, a controlled breath that carried the weight of acknowledgement. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice softer now, though still formal, based on the verified record. It is evident that you fulfilled your obligations as required. The words settled into the room with quiet authority, not imposed, but earned, and as such, the basis for this proceeding is no longer valid. The statement landed without resistance, without interruption, because there was nothing left to challenge. The evidence had spoken, and it had done so clearly. The clerk lowered her hands slightly, her posture relaxing just enough to signal the completion of something significant. The gallery remained silent, but the silence had transformed again, now Carrying a sense of closure rather than tension, a quiet understanding that the outcome had shifted entirely from where it began, Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the conclusion, but her expression remained unchanged, not triumphant, not relieved, simply steady, as if this result had always been the logical endpoint. Holloway looked at her for a moment longer, his gaze no longer searching, no longer measuring, but recognizing, and in that recognition, something unspoken passed. Between them, not agreement, not concession, but understanding. "This matter is dismissed," he said finally, the words clear, definitive, echoing softly through the courtroom, and with them came the end of the case, but not the end of the moment, because what had taken place extended beyond a simple dismissal. It had revealed something deeper, something that could not be undone. The gallery began to stir slightly, quiet movements replacing stillness, but no one spoke, no one broke the atmosphere that had settled over the room, because they all understood, in their own way, that they had witnessed more than a legal proceeding. They had witnessed a shift, a recalibration of perception, a moment where assumption had been replaced by clarity, and authority had been redefined not by position, but by understanding. Emily turned slightly, preparing to step away from the table, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the outcome required no reaction, only acknowledgement. And as she did, the room remained quiet, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Because the person who had once been seen as insignificant had just revealed something far more enduring, and in that silence, the lesson settled without needing to be spoken. Some truths do not need to be declared, they simply stand, undeniable, in the space they reshape. The echo of the gavel did not need to be loud to carry meaning. It settled into the room with a quiet finality that lingered long after the sound itself had faded, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire courtroom understood that something more than a case had just concluded. Emily Carter stepped back from the defendant's table with the same calm presence she had maintained from the beginning, her movements unhurried, deliberate, not seeking attention and yet holding it. Effortlessly, the polished floor reflected her steps as she turned slightly toward the aisle, the soft rhythm of her shoes the only sound that dared to break the silence. Judge Holloway remained seated, his posture still composed, but no longer rigid, his gaze following her for a brief moment, not with authority, not with judgment, but with something far quieter, something that resembled respect, though he did not speak it. Because some acknowledgments do not belong in words, the clerk began organizing the documents with careful precision, aligning each page as if restoring order to something that had briefly slipped beyond routine, her earlier urgency replaced by a steady focus. The gallery slowly shifted, people adjusting in their seats, exchanging glances that carried unspoken understanding. A man who had once leaned forward with skepticism now sat back, his expression thoughtful, as if reconsidering not just the case, but the assumptions that had framed it. A woman near the back lowered her gaze, her earlier indifference replaced by quiet reflection, because what they had witnessed was not dramatic in the way they expected. It had not been loud, it had not been chaotic, but it had been undeniable. Emily reached the aisle and paused for the briefest moment, not to look back, not to confirm anything, but simply to continue forward with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every word she had spoken. The door at the end of the courtroom stood slightly ajar, light spilling through the narrow opening, casting a soft line across the floor that seemed almost symbolic, though no one would say it out loud. And as she stepped toward it, the room remained still, not because it was required, but because something within it had shifted, something that demanded silence. Judge Holloway finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that carried the weight of recognition, his hands resting flat against the bench, no longer asserting, no longer directing, simply present. The authority he held had not disappeared, but it had been reframed, reshaped by a moment he had not anticipated, a moment that did not challenge his position, but clarified its limits. He glanced briefly at the record before him, now complete, accurate, aligned with the truth that had been there from the beginning, and for the first time that day, he did not look for error. He acknowledged correction, the kind that does not diminish authority, but defines it. The clerk finished aligning the final document and placed it neatly into the file, her movements careful, almost reverent, as if aware that this was no longer just paperwork, it was a record of something that mattered. The gallery began to rise slowly, not in unison, not with noise, but with a quiet respect that had replaced the earlier murmurs and assumptions. No one laughed, no one whispered, because there was nothing left to question. Emily reached the doorway and stepped through without hesitation, the light briefly outlining her figure before she disappeared into the hallway beyond, and even after she was gone, the space she had occupied did not feel empty, it felt defined, as if something she had brought into the room remained behind, not as a presence, but as a reminder. Judge Holloway lowered his gaze once more, then looked forward again, the room now settling into its usual form, yet not quite the same, because moments like this do not announce themselves as turning points, they simply exist, quiet, precise, undeniable, and in their presence, they leave something behind, something that reshapes how the next moment will unfold. The courtroom returned to its rhythm, the clerk preparing for the next case, the benches slowly clearing, the routine continuing as it always does, but beneath that routine, something had changed, something subtle, something lasting, and though no one spoke it aloud, it was understood, not through instruction, not through declaration, but through the quiet clarity of what had just taken place, that respect is not granted by position, it is revealed through understanding, and on that day, in a room built on authority, the truth had spoken in the calmest voice of all, and the world within those walls had listened.